Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. The fire in the marble hearth had already burned low when I realized the room had grown too quiet. Not the comfortable quiet of a late evening, not the peaceful silence of a home settling into night. This silence had weight to it, thick, watching, breathing, the kind that presses against your skin and makes you suddenly aware of every movement you make. I was standing near the hearth, one hand resting on the cool marble edge, the warmth of the fading fire brushing softly against my back. The room smelled faintly of smoke, leather, and the last traces of expensive whiskey. Behind me, the living room stretched out in dim amber light, shadows shifting across the furniture like secrets trying to stay hidden. And on the sofa sat my husband. He hadn't spoken in several minutes. His posture was still, shoulders squared, one arm draped along the back of the couch as though he were trying to appear relaxed. But his jaw was tight, the muscles flexing every time his eyes flicked toward me. There was something unreadable in his expression. Not anger exactly, not jealousy alone. Something heavier, something waiting. I felt it before I saw him move. The other man. His presence had filled the room all evening. Quiet confidence, lingering glances that lasted just a second too long. The kind of attention that starts as harmless curiosity but slowly begins to feel like gravity, pulling you closer whether you want it or not, or whether you should. Now he stood only a step away, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him at my back, close enough that the air between us seemed to spark every time either of us shifted. I didn't turn immediately. Part of me knew that if I did, something would change, something that couldn't easily be undone. A breath passed between us, then another. My fingers tightened slightly on the marble edge of the hearth. Behind us, the faint crackle of the dying fire was the only sound in the room. No music, no conversation. Just three people caught in a moment that seemed to stretch longer than time itself. When I finally glanced over my shoulder, our eyes met. His gaze held mine without hesitation. Dark and steady, carrying a quiet challenge that made my pulse skip. There was no rush in him, no clumsy boldness, just a slow, deliberate confidence that felt more dangerous than any reckless move could have been. The kind of confidence that made you wonder if he already knew the answer to a question he hadn't asked yet. I felt my breath catch, subtle, almost imperceptible, but enough that he noticed. And across the room my husband noticed too. The shift in the air was small but undeniable. A look, a pause, a silence that said far too much. My husband leaned forward slightly on the sofa, elbows resting on his knees now, his eyes moving between the two of us. There was tension there, yes, but also something else, something thoughtful, something conflicted. As if he could already sense the invisible line forming in the room, the kind of line people swear they'll never cross. The other man stepped closer, slowly enough that the movement felt almost accidental. The warmth of him brushed against my shoulder, sending a quiet shiver down my spine. Neither of us spoke. Words suddenly felt unnecessary, and maybe even dangerous. Across the room my husband exhaled slowly, the sound barely audible in the quiet, and for a moment none of us moved. Three people, one room, one fragile boundary hanging in the air between us, waiting to see who would break it first. The silence stretched just a little longer, like a held breath no one wanted to release first. I became painfully aware of how close he was standing behind me, not touching, not quite, but close enough that the warmth of him brushed the air along my back. Every small movement seemed louder than it should have been. The faint shift of fabric, the quiet inhale of breath, the soft crackle of the fire settling into glowing embers. Across the room my husband watched, his eyes moved slowly between us, studying the space that separated us. That thin, fragile space that suddenly felt like the most important distance in the world. "It's getting late," he finally said. His voice was calm, but there was something underneath it, something careful. I turned slightly at the sound, just enough to see him more clearly. The firelight cast long shadows across his face, emphasizing the tension in his jaw. He wasn't angry, not exactly. He looked like someone waiting to see how a story would unfold. Behind me, the other man shifted his weight. The movement was subtle, but it sent a quiet ripple through the air around us. "Maybe," he replied, his voice lower, measured. "Or maybe the night's just getting interesting." The words hung there, not quite a challenge, not quite a joke. My husband gave a faint, humorless smile, leaning back slightly against the sofa. "You always did like pushing boundaries, only the ones that are already bending." The room fell quiet again. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips where they rested against the cool marble. The stone should have grounded me, but instead it only made me more aware of everything else. The warmth behind me, the watchful gaze across the room, the strange electricity threading through all three of us. I turned a little more, finally facing the man beside me. Up close, his expression was calmer than I expected. There was no arrogance there, no reckless hunger, just focus. The kind that made it feel like the entire room had narrowed down to a single moment. "You're quiet," he said softly. "I'm thinking about leaving?" The question was simple, but it carried weight. I hesitated. "Maybe." He tilted his head slightly, studying my face the way someone might study a painting they weren't finished understanding yet. "You don't look like someone who wants to leave." Across the room, my husband shifted again. The leather sofa creaked softly under his movement. "Careful," he said lightly, though his eyes stayed sharp. "You might start sounding persuasive." The other man glanced toward him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Would that bother you?" For a moment my husband didn't answer. The fire popped quietly in the hearth. Finally, he leaned forward again, resting his elbows on his knees the way he had earlier. But now his expression had changed. Less guarded, more curious. "I think," he said slowly, "that depends on what exactly you're trying to persuade." The tension in the room tightened. I felt it in the way the other man's shoulders squared slightly beside me, in the way my husband's gaze sharpened. Neither of them looked away, and suddenly I understood something strange and unsettling. This wasn't just happening to me. They were both waiting for a signal, a choice, something small but undeniable that would decide where this moment went next. I swallowed quietly, aware that both of them were watching me now. The firelight flickered across the marble, across their faces, across the space between us. And for the first time that night I realized the boundary in this room might not belong to either of them. It might belong to me. The question was, did I actually want to keep it? The room seemed smaller now, not because anything had changed. The same fire still glowed in the marble hearth. The same shadows moved slowly across the walls, but because every glance, every breath, every quiet movement carried more weight than before. Neither man had moved far from where they stood, and neither had I. It felt strange to realize that the entire night had slowly folded into this single moment. 3 people caught in a silence that felt louder than any argument. The man beside me exhaled quietly. "You're thinking too hard," he said. His voice was softer now, almost careful. I let out a small breath that might have been a laugh. "You sound very sure about that." "I am." I glanced at him, raising an eyebrow. "And how would you know?" For a moment he didn't answer. His gaze lingered on my face, thoughtful, as if he were measuring something invisible. "Because people only look like that when they're arguing with themselves." Across the room my husband shifted again. He leaned back slightly on the sofa, one hand running slowly along his jaw as he watched us. His expression wasn't angry, not the way someone might expect. If anything, he looked conflicted. "You always did enjoy reading people," my husband said after a moment. The other man turned his head toward him, one corner of his mouth lifting slightly. "Only when they're interesting." "And is she interesting?" my husband asked. The question landed in the center of the room like a dropped coin. My breath caught. The man beside me didn't answer immediately. His gaze drifted back toward me, slower this time, more deliberate. "Yes," he said quietly. The word wasn't loud, but it carried something steady and undeniable. For a second none of us spoke. I became aware of the way my fingers were still resting against the marble edge of the hearth, the cool surface grounding me while everything else felt uncertain. The other man's hand shifted slightly at his side, close enough that I noticed the movement. Too close. Our fingers brushed. It was barely anything, the lightest accidental contact, but the effect was immediate. A quiet spark ran up my arm before I could stop it. I pulled my hand back instinctively, not because I didn't want the touch, but because I did. "Too much," he noticed. Of course he did. His gaze dropped briefly to where my hand had been before returning to my face. There was no smugness in his expression, no assumption. Just understanding. "Sorry," he murmured. "You didn't do anything," I said quickly, and yet the air between us had changed again. Across the room, my husband watched the entire exchange. His eyes narrowed slightly, though not with anger. It was something deeper than that, something thoughtful, almost uneasy. "You know," he said slowly, "most people would have left by now." The other man turned toward him again. "Most people don't get invited to stay." "I didn't say you were invited." A quiet smile flickered across the other man's face. "You also didn't say I should leave." The fire cracked softly, sending a brief shower of sparks up the chimney. My husband looked down at the floor for a moment, his fingers tapping lightly against his knee. Then he looked up again. His gaze moved from the other man to me, and something about the look in his eyes made my chest tighten. "You think this is simple," he said quietly. Neither of us answered, because somehow we all knew the truth. It wasn't simple. Not the pull in the room, not the unspoken tension threading through every glance. And definitely not the quiet secret sitting between the 3 of us, the one no one had said out loud yet. The other man stepped back slightly then. Just a single step, but the distance felt deliberate. "I don't think it's simple," he said calmly. My husband studied him for a long moment. Then he leaned back again, exhaling slowly. "No," he said. "You probably don't." The firelight flickered across the room again, shadows dancing along the walls as the quiet returned. But this time the silence felt heavier, because now we all knew something dangerous had almost happened, and the only reason it hadn't was because someone had chosen to step away. The quiet that followed felt almost fragile. For a few seconds no one moved. The other man's step back had created space, but somehow the tension in the room only grew stronger. The fire continued its slow, steady glow behind me, sending flickers of light across the marble and into the shadows of the living room. I could feel both of their eyes on me, not demanding, not forcing, just waiting. The strange thing was that the room didn't feel divided anymore. It felt like a single moment stretched between three people who all understood something had shifted. My husband stood up first. The soft creak of the leather sofa broke the stillness. When I turned slightly, he was already walking toward us, slow and deliberate, his expression thoughtful in a way that made my chest tighten. He stopped near the coffee table, close enough now that the firelight touched his face. "You know what the problem is," he said quietly. Neither of us answered, because something in his voice made it clear he wasn't really asking a question. He looked at the other man first. "You've always had this way of walking into a room like you belong there." The other man gave a faint shrug. "Confidence isn't a crime." "No," my husband said softly, "but it does complicate things." His eyes moved to me then. The look wasn't accusing, it wasn't angry, it was honest, and that somehow felt more dangerous than anything else tonight. "What complicates things," he continued slowly, "is that she looks at you like she's trying not to." The words landed gently, but they carried weight. My breath caught before I could stop it. The other man didn't respond right away. For the first time since he arrived, something uncertain flickered across his face. Finally he spoke. "I wasn't planning to." The honesty of it made the room feel even quieter. My husband tilted his head slightly. "Planning what?" "Feeling anything." The fire crackled softly behind us. I looked between them, suddenly aware that the air felt heavier than before, like something unspoken had finally stepped into the light. My husband let out a slow breath. "Funny thing about feelings," he murmured. "They rarely wait for permission." The other man glanced at me then, not boldly, not teasing, just, honestly, and somehow that made the moment far more intense. "You should probably say something," he said gently. My throat felt dry. What exactly am I supposed to say? The truth. 3 simple words, but they felt enormous. For a moment I stared at the floor, watching the soft reflection of the fire move across the polished wood. My thoughts raced, searching for something safe to say, but nothing safe felt honest. Finally I looked up. "It would be easier," I admitted quietly, "if I didn't notice when you walk into a room." Neither man spoke. The other man took a slow breath, his eyes holding mine now with a quiet intensity that made my pulse quicken. "And do you?" he asked softly. "Notice?" I hesitated, then nodded once. "Yes." The space between us seemed to hum with something alive. He stepped forward again, just one step, not enough to invade the space, but enough that the warmth between us returned. His hand lifted slightly, almost unconsciously, like he might reach for mine, but he stopped. The moment hung there, close enough that I could feel the echo of the touch that hadn't happened. My husband watched the two of us carefully, his expression unreadable now. The fire behind me flared softly, shadows shifting across the room as if the entire house had leaned closer to witness the moment. No one spoke, no one moved, and yet it felt like everything had already changed, because the truth was finally in the room, and none of us could pretend we didn't feel it anymore. Outside. Calm. The rain began quietly. At first it was only a faint tapping against the tall windows of the living room, soft and irregular, like the night itself was unsure whether it wanted to stay or pass through. But slowly the sound grew steadier, wrapping the house in a gentle rhythm that seemed to soften the edges of everything inside. The fire in the marble hearth had burned lower now, glowing more than burning, filling the room with a warm amber light. None of us had turned on the lamps. The dimness felt right. The other man stood only a few steps away from me now, not distant like before, not cautious, just present. Between us hung the quiet weight of everything that had been said, and everything that hadn't. Across the room my husband watched us. But the look in his eyes had changed. The tight tension from earlier had softened into something more complicated, something reflective, as though he understood that the night had crossed a line long before anyone realized it. Rain slid slowly down the window behind him, blurring the lights of the city outside. For a moment none of us spoke. Then my husband exhaled softly, the sound almost lost beneath the rhythm of the rain. "Well," he said quietly. I think the night has made its decision. I turned toward him. There was no anger in his voice, just honesty, a strange calm. The other man looked toward him too, uncertainty flickering briefly across his face, the first real hesitation I had seen from him all evening. You're not angry, he said. My husband gave a small, tired smile. I might be tomorrow. The answer was simple, but it carried an understanding that made the room feel strangely peaceful. Then his eyes moved back to me. But tonight, he added softly, I think you should stop pretending you don't feel what you feel. My breath caught. The rain outside grew heavier, tapping gently against the glass. When I looked back at the man standing in front of me, something had shifted in his expression too. The restraint that had held him back all evening was still there, but it was thinner now, more fragile. He stepped closer. This time neither of us stopped it. The warmth between us returned instantly, like a current reconnecting. I could feel the quiet rise and fall of his breathing, the calm steadiness of him standing there, waiting, not rushing, just waiting. You don't have to, he said quietly. His voice had softened. I looked up at him. I know. For a moment we simply stood there, close enough that the air between us felt warmer than the rest of the room. The firelight flickered softly across his face, across the edges of my dress, across the floor beneath us. Then his hand lifted slowly, not suddenly, not urgently, just carefully. When his fingers finally touched mine, the contact was so gentle it almost felt imagined, but it wasn't. The warmth of his hand settled around mine, steady and quiet, like it had been there all along. My breath softened. The rain outside filled the silence, a slow curtain of sound wrapping the night around us. He stepped closer then, and I felt the space between our hearts disappear. His forehead rested lightly against mine. Nothing rushed, nothing forced. The moment unfolded slowly, like the night itself had been waiting for this exact second. My breath mingled with his. The warmth of his presence surrounded me. And for the first time all evening the tension inside my chest eased. Across the room my husband watched quietly, his expression thoughtful but calm. No one spoke. Words weren't needed anymore. The fire glowed softly, rain whispered against the windows. And in the quiet warmth of that room, beneath the soft amber light of the hearth, something unspoken finally gave way, not with urgency, but with the quiet certainty of two people who had tried very hard not to cross a line, and finally allowed themselves to stop resisting. Morning arrived quietly. The rain had stopped some time before dawn, leaving the world outside washed clean and strangely still. Pale sunlight filtered through the tall windows, soft and hesitant, as if it too was unsure how to enter the room after everything the night had held. The fire in the marble hearth had burned out hours ago. Only faint gray ash remained. I stood near the window, wrapped loosely in a light blanket from the sofa. The glass was cool beneath my fingertips as I traced a faint line through the condensation left by the rain. The house felt different in the morning. Not ruined, not broken, just changed. Behind me the living room was quiet. The dim golden warmth of the night had been replaced by the soft honesty of daylight, revealing everything in clear lines. The coffee table, the empty glasses, the sofa where my husband now sat silently. He hadn't spoken much since sunrise, but he hadn't left the room either. That felt important. You didn't sleep, he said finally. His voice wasn't sharp. It was gentle in a way that made me turn. He sat leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees, staring thoughtfully at the floor. The early light traced the edges of his face, softening the tension that had once been there. Not really, I admitted. He nodded slightly. I figured. For a moment the quiet returned. The kind of quiet that happens when two people are trying to understand something that doesn't have simple words yet. I looked toward the doorway. He left early. My husband's eyes lifted slowly to meet mine. I know. Something about his calm answer made my chest tighten. You saw him go. I heard the door. There was no accusation in the statement, just truth. He leaned back against the sofa then, rubbing a hand across the back of his neck as though he were searching for the right thought among many. That man always had good timing, he said after a moment. I couldn't tell if it was a joke, or something else. Outside a car passed slowly along the quiet street, its tires whispering across the damp pavement. Are you angry? I asked quietly. The question lingered in the room. My husband thought about it for a long moment. I think, he said slowly, anger would be easier. I waited, but it wouldn't be honest. His eyes moved toward the window beside me, watching the pale morning light shift across the glass. We've been drifting for a while, he said. The words landed softly, but they carried weight, the kind of truth people often avoid saying out loud. You noticed it too. It wasn't a question. I lowered my gaze. Yes. Another quiet moment passed. Then he sighed, standing up slowly from the sofa. The movement felt deliberate, like someone deciding to step into a new chapter even if they didn't fully understand it yet. He walked toward the window until he stood beside me. For a while we both simply watched the morning outside. The clean sky, the quiet street, the world continuing exactly as it always had. Strange thing, he murmured. What? That last night didn't feel like something breaking. His eyes turned toward me again. It felt like something finally being said. The words lingered between us. Before I could respond, a sudden knock echoed through the house. Both of us froze. The sound came again, firm but not impatient. My husband and I exchanged a quick glance. Were you expecting anyone? He asked. I shook my head. He walked toward the door slowly, curiosity replacing the quiet heaviness of the morning. When he opened it, a familiar voice drifted into the house. I hope I'm not too early. I felt my breath catch, because standing on the doorstep, sunlight behind him, was the man who had left before dawn, and the look in his eyes suggested that whatever had begun last night wasn't finished yet. The morning light grew stronger as the door slowly opened wider. For a moment no one spoke. The man standing outside looked much the same as he had the night before, calm, composed, almost frustratingly steady, but something in his eyes had softened. The quiet confidence was still there, yet it carried a trace of uncertainty now, as if even he didn't fully know what this moment might become. My husband stood in the doorway, one hand resting lightly against the frame. You forgot something? He asked. The question held the faintest hint of dry humor. The other man shook his head. No, he said gently. I just didn't like how the night ended. Behind them I could see the pale sky stretching over the quiet street, the world already moving on as if nothing unusual had happened at all. But inside the house everything still felt suspended. My husband studied him for a long moment before stepping slightly aside, opening the door wider. Well, he said calmly, you might as well come in then. The other man hesitated, only briefly. Then he stepped inside. The living room filled again with the quiet presence that had shaped the night before. But in the daylight everything felt clearer, less mysterious, more honest. He looked toward me, not boldly, not claiming anything, just acknowledging. Good morning, he said. I felt a small strange smile tug at the corner of my mouth. Morning. For a moment the three of us stood there again, almost the same positions as the night before, yet somehow different. The shadows were gone now, replaced by gentle daylight that revealed every expression clearly. No secrets hiding in the dark. My husband walked slowly back toward the sofa and sat down again, watching us with thoughtful eyes. You know, he said after a moment, most people would run from a situation like this. The other man leaned lightly against the back of a chair, folding his arms. I thought about it. What changed your mind? He glanced toward me again. I realized leaving might have been easier, he admitted, but it wouldn't have been honest. The words settled quietly in the room. My husband nodded slowly as though he respected the answer. I walked closer then, stopping near the coffee table where the empty glasses from the night before still rested. Everything about this moment felt strangely calm. No raised voices, no accusations, just three people standing in the aftermath of something real. Finally my husband spoke again. Last night wasn't about betrayal, he said carefully. At least not the way people usually mean it. His eyes met mine. It was about truth showing up in a room where no one expected it. Emotion tightened in my chest. The other man straightened slightly, listening. And sometimes, my husband continued, truth doesn't destroy things. He gestured softly around the room. Sometimes it just forces people to see what they've been avoiding. Silence followed his words. But it wasn't uncomfortable. It was thoughtful. Outside, sunlight moved slowly across the wet pavement, the last traces of rain beginning to disappear. The other man stepped closer to me then. Not boldly, not urgently, simply close enough that the quiet warmth between us returned again. For a second I wondered what this moment would become. A goodbye, a beginning, or something in between. He lifted his hand slowly and rested it gently over mine. The gesture was simple, respectful, but it carried everything the night before had left unsaid. My husband watched the moment with calm eyes. Then he stood and walked toward the window, giving us space without making it feel like distance. And suddenly the truth became clear. This story hadn't been about choosing one person over another. It had been about honesty, the kind that arrives quietly, shakes the air a little, and leaves people braver than before. The other man's forehead rested softly against mine. Just for a moment, not possession, not urgency, just warmth. And as the sunlight filled the room it felt less like something had ended, and more like three lives had simply turned a page. Not perfectly, not easily, but honestly. Some nights burn bright and disappear. But others leave behind something softer, a memory, a truth, a quiet warmth that lingers long after the fire has gone out.